Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
All right, everyone, thanks for coming. I know it's the nicest day. I was telling Rich, the first nice day of the year, and he's here, but I really want to thank him for coming. There's a couple of quick things. Next Thursday, Sheila Otto is going to be here. She teaches at Albany Medical College and at the Alden March Bioethics Institute. She's going to review a book called Last Rites, Rescuing the End of Life from the Medical System. She spoke here a couple of years ago, and she was excellent, so you really should come to that. In May, many book groups all over the country and libraries are going to be reading this book. It's called The Big Read, Their Eyes Were Watching God. If any of you are part of a book group and want some copies, come and see me later. We'll give you some copies to use. We're going to have a discussion here on May 23rd. But we're going to have a new book review just like this of this book. And our reviewer is going to be Brenda Twiggs. She's the director of Hudson Valley's library, and she's a member of a lot of different book groups. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think she may have taught African American history a few times. And finally, Ari Kane's going to be here in May 24th for a new book review. He's going to review Gore Vidal's Point-to-Point Navigation. It's a memoir from 1964 to 2006. So there's things back there describing them all. And so finally, I really want to thank Rich for coming because, most people who come and do a book review, they share what they think about the book, and usually that's it. But Rich has sort of as he'll tell you, he's going to be sharing more than just his thoughts on the book because he'll probably be telling you about his life a little bit. So I really want to thank him for doing that and for coming to the library. So thanks.
And I just found out I was supposed to actually read the book. No, actually I did. And it's funny because the title is The Science and Fiction of Autism. From the title alone, you think, what people think and what it really is and so on. And the way it was broken up, she started off with the overview of the whole condition itself, where it comes from, the increase in the diagnoses of autism. And the one that really throws myself and a lot of people, the spectrum of it all, it's huge. I mean, on one end, and I do an occasional fill-in show on WRW, and I speak about my son from time to time, who, on the spectrum, he'd be on the lower end. He's nonverbal. Can be somewhat difficult behavior. Can one? Please. He's extremely difficult behaviorally, and it's just one of those things where you have to figure out, what strategies are going to work, and from things as simple as dressing, feeding, the most basic forms of communications, and the biggest stumbling blocks, and there are probably many, I'll probably say that a lot, the biggest problem, which I'll probably say all afternoon, is transitions. One of them is. Simple thing is going from the living room to the school bus. It's like pulling out a tooth. It's something very difficult. But the more you work at it, and I think the more you expect the child to perform that task, you're going to see some progress. And that's one of the keys, I think, is really having that expectation. I'm getting off track a little bit. So that's the lower end. Then you hear of other people. Joe and I were talking earlier. She's an author, Temple Grandin. She's a PhD. She has a Asperger's diagnosis, if not indeed autism. And she was self-treating in large part in terms of her own condition to make herself better. And in many ways she did. Obviously she did. She's a PhD. She's an author. She's done remarkable work. So the book talks about that entire spectrum and the expectations of people, the expectations of society, and the increases in the diagnosis itself. And this was interesting to me. It may not be interesting to you. It was interesting to me. She talks about in the 60s and 70s, people were diagnosed in such smaller numbers in terms of being autistic. 90s, 2000, the numbers just went through the roof. And I thought maybe one of the reasons is, maybe we always had it, we were just calling it something different. And it's nice to see that somebody sort of agrees with me in this book, and she does. For the longest time, during the earlier time, from the 60s, we call it mentally retarded. This is what people were referred to as. Sure, they displayed different abilities and indeed disabilities, but still the diagnosis was, oh, he or she is mentally retarded. And now everybody seems to be under the umbrella of autism. So do we have more autistic people, or do we have the same amount and we're just calling it a different thing? And that may be something, worth pursuing. I seem to think that maybe, because there's such a wide range of abilities and, again, disabilities within the spectrum. And how did it get here all of a sudden? I mean, that's the one that kills me. How did it get here all of a sudden? It's the latest thing. He's autistic. She's autistic. He's on the spectrum. She's on the spectrum. And it just doesn't happen. But that was one of the things that struck me. She goes into the characteristics. And if you're familiar with the condition, you'll be familiar with where I'm going with this. The vacant stare. The complexity of it all and how it's incurable. Now, there's some hope. It couldn't have come at a better time. I mentioned my son earlier, which I will do as well a lot. Couldn't come at a better time. Earlier, I was saying, the transitions, just ridiculously difficult. But as time goes on, things get easier. They really do. And that's what I'm saying. Boy, I'm glad I showed up today, because the last 6 months, things have been looking up in the Vassi household. I couldn't be happier. No, really. I mean, there's acknowledgement, when I'm talking to him. I talked to you earlier about expectations. He's starting to live up to the expectations. Sure, he's still acting out. Don't get carried away. No, he's not a model citizen yet. But we're a lot closer today than we were 17 years ago. Things like the typical characteristics, the vacant stare. If anyone is familiar with this condition, you must be familiar with the vacant stare and what's going on in there. And you try to communicate with someone whose affect is not participating with what you want to do. It's that vacant stare. And what do you do with it? Do you back away? Do you force yourself in? Do you lose your temper? Once in a while I did. But you can't help yourself sometimes, You want to scream. But still, if you stay with it, you'll get somewhere. You really will. And you have to know enough, too, to back off when you're not going to be effective anymore and try, and live to fight another day. It's cliche. You have to pick your own battles. And with autism, it's especially true. Because it'll wear you out, I look at my son, we're having dinner, and he's doing fine, and, he'll do something, out of the ordinary. And I'll look at him dead in the face and say, you're sucking the life right out of me. And he thinks it's funny, too. So it's like, okay, good. We got somewhere. It's funny because it's true, And my wife's how don't say, it's true. What can I tell you? He chuckles. But it's nice, to see that, that heightened awareness in him. And I don't mean to monopolize this discussion with my family, and I won't. I promise you, I will move on to the book. Bizarre behaviors. It's really tough on families and careers, you can imagine. And, because of the unanswerable question, what is it and where does it come from? In terms of the bizarre behaviors, self-stimulating behaviors, you'll see a lot of rocking and things like this. But, in certain examples, and again, I'll use my son again, it was funny. For the longest time, I'm thinking when he was around 10 years old or so, she talks about, bizarre behaviors. And it'd be a lot of this, and this would be constant. And not only was it this, but as I'm watching and observing, his eyes are over here on the right, planted. And there's a hitch before he comes the other way. And I'm thinking, oh, good. You want to make your father crazy, too. This is great. And it went on, and he just fell into this thing. This was one of those behaviors that just came out of the blue. And he just fell into it. But still, you sit there and you wonder, what the heck is going on? What he's not doing this just to do it. And there has to be a reason for it, but how do you know? So now there's going to be a halting in my speech because I noticed my wife just walked in. There's the lovely Mrs. Vassi right there. You could stand up and say hello to everybody. Critical evaluation of autism. You'll remember this. The testimonials and the anecdotal reports. Things that just people reported on. Their own miracles is really what this is. No scientific basis for any of it, but you hear about it all the time. Page 9 and 10 in my book. Then the mother heard about a television report of a child who had shown dramatic progress after receiving treatments with a hormone called secretin. She arranged to have secretin given to her son and reported a dramatic improvement in the child's behavior. He began speaking spontaneously, was more socially engaged with the family and others, was calmer, and showed a variety of other positive changes. Needless to say, the family was thrilled, and they attributed their son's improvement to secretin. When I was reading this, it just reminded me of what my wife and I went through. We found out about this as well. And I have a few friends who know doctors, etc. It was on Dateline or something. But this is another example of that anecdotal evidence, testimonials that people, oh my God, it's a miracle, And when people hear this, that are in our situation, and say, okay, where are my sneakers? We got to run to this stuff right now. So we did our research. We tried finding people. We recorded the show, to help back us up. Say, look at, watch this, and you'll be able to help us too. To find this hormone. A doctor to do the injection. So, we pass it around. We show some friends, and it doesn't bear much fruit initially. But eventually, we found somebody. Actually, we found them on our own down in Rhinebeck, and I can't remember the doctor's name. We probably shouldn't say it. But so we found a physician that was willing to give the injection, and it's not approved by any insurance companies. Certainly no FDA approval or anything like that. And we went forward with it. After looking into it, our first objective was to do no harm, and we were convinced that we wouldn't because we knew enough people who had it. So we went that direction, and it's funny how it can play into you because on the way home, we were convinced that there was progress. It really wasn't, but we were convinced that there was. Oh, look, he's looking at us, or he's more attentive doing this and that. And okay, The downside is there's disappointment. The upside is that there's always hope. There's always hope. You always have that sense of optimism that, you're going to stumble on it, and it's going to get better, as long as you just keep trying. The secretin was one example. And she goes on to say, the good news is what gets reported in these testimonials. And she goes on to say it's important to remember that typically the positive experience and outcomes are the ones that are reported. People who experience failures are those not likely to write magazine articles or sit with Katie Couric on the Today Show. And she's pretty good. That's absolutely right. So the anecdotal stuff, it has some value. I wouldn't say it doesn't, because I think it does. But you really can't bet the house on it. Other things, in terms of anecdotal examples, auditory training. There's some thought. She doesn't touch on this part in the book, but there's some thought that it's an auditory defect. The whole root of autism. These guys aren't hearing things correctly. They're not sending the messages into the brain correctly through the auditory system or what have you. So it's not so much that they can't express themselves. Maybe they're not getting the appropriate messages to begin with. Maybe. And there was a facility down in Jersey that had auditory training. I believe it was called the Davis Center, and they ran a series of tests and exercises with us, and it showed some improvement. It's hard to really measure these things, But that's another example, again, of the testimonies and the anecdotal stuff. You may remember this one, facilitated communication. It's where the child is assisted by an instructor, supporting the hand, and ask questions, and they respond through spelling by touching a keyboard and spelling out words. And that was the greatest thing. I mean, my son was able to tell me that he knew his father was a Giants fan and things like that. And we bought it, and to be honest with you, I still buy it today. I don't dismiss it like they did in 60 Minutes. I just don't, because once they got a hold of it, and they were able to prove, with their approach that it didn't work, instructors were overly enthusiastic or what have you, and they were saying it didn't work. Well, it did have value, because if you saw the enthusiasm between the student and teacher and how it enhanced that relationship, they completely missed that part of the story. There was something very positive that happened, although the result wasn't what we anticipated or were led to believe. I'll grant you that. But they missed the boat on that teacher-student relationship, which was very impressive. I mean, you'd see these teachers saying, look, I think we got something here. And that, just drives more enthusiasm toward the whole teaching experience. Your son gets more attention. Your son gets more positive strokes. So what? It doesn't work. We're forming a great relationship here, and we just blew right past it. Because once that report came out on 60 Minutes, that was it. Game was over. All the keyboards were tossed away. It was labeled a fake, a farce. Don't bother. And they really did. I think they missed the boat on that one. And that's too bad. But that was another one of those, if you will, testimonials, anecdotal pieces of research that people talk about. In addition to that, mega vitamins, different supplements determined to help your child with this condition. She talks about characteristics of autism, delayed speech, non-communicating, lack of initiation, lack of interest, tracking things. You know how, if I were to throw this here, your eyes are going to follow it. A lot of these kids don't. They don't make that. Once it's gone, and maybe it never existed, as far as they're concerned. So there's that lack of tracking, the lack of toys and books, and just that lack of interest in other humans. And that is the most frustrating characteristic of this condition. And as I mentioned before, the self-stimulating behavior. So where does this all lead you? Well, it's kind of hard to get out in social settings from time to time. Boy, they can embarrass you, these kids. Oh, my God. The things that they can do. We were in, and I don't think they mean to, but my God. We were in Mass one day, and I think it was a healing Mass at the Orisville Shrine. And my son was very young. And this is his example, but there are probably a million like him, if you're familiar with this condition. And I'm standing in line with him, and he couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 years old. And I'm holding on to him, and this older woman is standing in front of me. And, my son's adorable. He's a gorgeous-looking boy. He really is. And he looks like his mother. And this woman's standing in front of me. And she turns around and says, oh, what a lovely child. Well, that lovely child proceeded to grab her glasses and throw them across the church. And I'm thinking, I'm going to hell. Oh no! What do I do now? Here's this poor lady. She comes to church for some peace, and my son's terrorizing her. Isn't that great? So, needless to say, there are many instances like that. And listen, you just got to roll with the punches. That's all there is to it. I mentioned before the increased incidences in autism. And there are a lot, and the frustrating part is the spectrum from A to Z, from the lowest functioning to very high functioning professors to low functioning people who really have a hard time sleeping at night and doing a lot of other things that you and I just take for granted. What causes it? Now that's an age-old question. And Joe and I were talking earlier about one of the segments in the book, which was new to me. And it was very interesting. But, what caused it? Environmental, sociological, what have you? Who knows? And I'm sure you know the old adage, the mother this and the whatever. It's insanity. One point this author brings up, though, which was very interesting. Men and women are different. She didn't bring that up. I made that up myself. Men have this tendency to just, sometimes go through life with blinders on. Do not bother me. I'm busy. What are you bothering me for? I got things to do. Straight ahead focus. Women, on the other hand, by and large, empathy for other people. I'm really concerned about you and how you feel and so on. Okay, I think reasonable people can agree that, sure, that's sort of describes it, generally speaking. The author talks about, in utero, increased amounts of testosterone. Now, it's not a theory, it's a hypothesis. Somebody's taking a guess here. Increased amounts of testosterone. And how did they label it? Page 98. Autism as an extreme version of the male brain. And in this segment, she talks about increased amounts of testosterone present in utero. And all this testosterone, I'm paraphrasing here, just rushes in. How, why, I don't know. I don't know the whys. This is just what she's saying. And it turns this baby, this little boy in most cases, into this, how did I phrase it? See, when you lose your momentum, when you don't listen to yourself. Autism as an extreme version of the male brain, and it creates this presence of the extreme male brain, where it's focused, and nothing's getting in my way. Leave me alone. I'm busy. I may be busy doing nothing, but I'm busy. So, and it sort of made sense. I mean, geez, I think about when I'm wrapped up in something. Geez, don't bug me. And so maybe that's something. Maybe there's something there. I don't know. I thought it was very interesting. That whole point she was making. Early intervention. I'm glad I got to this part because she starts off the book with early intervention programs. Speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy. Trying to direct behaviors is what they get into. When we first got into this early intervention thing, we had a couple hours a week maybe of a therapist coming to our house. She's talking about 15, 20 hours a week. Intensity, token system, do this to get this. So many of these kids don't make that connection, If I dress myself, I'll get a candy. That concept is meaningless to a lot of these kids. So if you start real early, you might get lucky in drilling these things home and how to behave and different tasks, and it's tedious. It is. I mean, it's really painstakingly difficult to stay in it as much as you have to. But if you do, you're going to get great results. You really are. And if you're, and if given the opportunity to move forward with this in terms of the consistency, and that's the important thing, the consistency. And it's difficult. It's cliche again, You've got to be consistent with these kids. Sure. But try it sometime. It wears you out. So I was saying at the dinner table, this kid's sucking the life out of me, And you have to, figure out a way to stay with it. Probably more importantly, though, you talk about these treatments and so on and so forth. I heard a stat the other day, 80% of families don't make it. The divorce rate, separation rate. It's enormous. And that's got to change. If I'm going to make any commentary at all, that's the one I would make. That's got to change. You got to stick together. There's no way one person can do this himself. There's no way. It's so unfair just to be so selfish and say, no, this is too hard. Too bad it's too hard. You guys are in this together, and that's the way it is. And if you stick together, you're going to get some results. I guarantee it. I absolutely guarantee it. Especially if you get through adolescence, namely puberty. If you get through puberty without setting your hair on fire, it's a miracle. Because we talked about this male brain thing. It really shifts into high gear around 14, 16 years old. And watch out, because you don't know what's coming. the aggression picks up. They're not sleeping. And if this isn't all kids, this is a little self-therapy here, so hold on. They're not sleeping, and if they're not sleeping, you're not sleeping. And you take turns. Oh, it's my turn. No, it's not. It's your turn. Get up and take care of that kid. But, if you get through it, which you will, just stick together and get through it and figure out, how am I going to get through, the rest of this week without any sleep? And once you do, you're in much better shape. And then, when it's over, you feel pretty good because, you made some progress. And then things start to settle down. And bringing it, to now, today. I mean, my son and other 19-year-old boys that are autistic, I would assume, this is not her thought, this is mine. I would assume they're starting to grow out of it. There's a level of maturity that's starting to take hold. Adolescence is on its way out. You're starting to look at that in the rearview mirror. And, there's a sense of maturity kicking in, a sense of appreciation maybe for who his parents are. Able to make transitions better, from pushing him out the door to go to school to actually watching, picking up his bag and going onto the school bus. Wow, it's all right. Other things, handling crowds better, handling noise better, handling distractions better, doing better in school. And I'm afraid to keep saying this out loud because when I do, things just go right down the toilet after that. He knows, somehow he knows that I'm bragging about him, and then the roof falls in. I don't know how he knows, but he knows. To sum up the book, though, I think what she's trying to say is that there's so much out there in terms of what needs to be learned about it. And I agree. In terms of her introducing the early intervention component in terms of treatment, and then not talking, and I didn't even mention, shame on me, the inclusionary aspect of education. Perhaps you've heard of this. Inclusion meaning, have my kid in a regular classroom with regular kids. The idea being that he will model from, quote unquote, normal kids and model normal behavior. Geez, in theory, that's a good idea. And that's what we want. Unfortunately, I think you have to be at a certain level of functioning to be able to, benefit from that scenario of inclusion. And if you're not, then you're doing a couple things. It's not fair to your kid, and it's not fair to the other kids in that classroom who are witness to some behaviors that can be pretty bizarre. So it's up to the parents to really try to be as objective as they can. What parts of inclusion make sense for my kid? And not just my kid, but for other kids in the classroom. Listen, we do a lot of great things in this society in terms of the efforts we make to educate kids like mine. And I tell you, we appreciate it very, very much because, not many societies would make the sacrifices that we have made, for kids like mine. So, we really have to think twice. Okay, what's best for my kid, but how will that affect the rest of the population that he's in terms of that classroom? As we go on, in terms of the inclusionary experience, sure, they can learn great things socially by modeling their peers. And it's a wonderful approach. But you have to be able to make that call. Is it appropriate or not? We tried it for a few years, had some success, but found that, a better place is a more dedicated classroom toward kids with autism. And that's where our son was placed, and he's doing very well. As far as she's concerned, the author, Schreibman, I only wanted to say it once because I knew I was going to butcher her name, and I hope I didn't the second time. As far as she's concerned, though, she starts off with early intervention and then jumps to conclusion toward the end of the book. You may want to try and connect those two dots sooner in terms of the reading, in terms of the approach, especially academically. So that, my friends, is the science and fiction of autism interpreted by yours truly. And thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, do we do that, Joe? And if you don't have any questions, that's fine too. Yes?
You mentioned the testosterone surge.
Yeah.
In utero, you're saying.
Uh-huh.
Have they ever tested these children for testosterone levels?
Not.
Has
Not according to this in terms of any case studies, no. This is a hypothesis pretty much in
Yeah.
terms of the author's thinking. And when I first read it, it sort of kind of made sense.
Yeah.
You know?
I just wondered if they were, and if so, if anything had ever been tried to kind of counter that or neutralize it.
You know, the thing is, you know, we're always trying, we're always looking for something, and that's, you know, sometimes remedies come just from, you know, really good ideas.
Yeah.
And that just might be a really good idea.
Well, it could be ruled out certainly
Sure,
as
yeah.
existing or not existing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Is there such a thing, I believe there probably is, a society of autistic children, in other words, a group that is in charge of autistic behavior in terms of medicine, and in other words, a group like, well, not the American Medical Association.
No, I understand what you're saying.
More specifically toward autism, and have they ever produced for people who have autistic children some scenario where they have studied the basic spectrum of all and found out what levels have been increased to a better level of understanding, of awareness, of a stage where it's more easy for the parents to deal with. In other words, they have examples
Right.
all over the country.
And I think what happens here, though, in many ways, I don't think there's one governing body, and if there is, please, you know, chime in. But what happens is you have different subgroups. We did some work with the Autism Research and Review out of California, and the founder there formed something called DAN, Defeat Autism Now. And somebody else has something, Cure Autism Now, CAN. So you have all these other special, and locally we have the Autistic Society, and we have an Albany chapter. So everybody has their own interest group, you know, their own group that expresses their interest and tries to lobby for, you know, education dollars and those types of things. So, but in terms of a Center for Disease Control dedicated to autism, no, not that I know of.
My thought was that if a person had this situation, they'd be probably very interested to know other situations that have shown improvement, and in other words, specific examples where they might be able to get even a book together.
Right.
And over the years, not just this year.
And I think we have that at some level, as I was talking about earlier, the anecdotal examples that you see from time to time, whether it's secretin, whether it's auditory training, what have you. Nothing to the extent, you know, where you have the double-blind tests that are required to have any type of, you know, legitimate, you know, treatment or experiment done. Most of this that we see now is, you know, just testimonials and you know, anecdotal experiences.
Do you know if it's more prevalent in males than females?
It's much more prevalent in males, and she spoke to the to that condition when I mentioned the testosterone episode. 8 out of 10, perhaps I think is the number, 80%, somewhere in there. Affects boys more so than girls, and yeah, it's.
A while back, CNN had a special video on about a woman who made a video about her own life living in the world of autism, and it was really very fascinating. Perhaps it'll come back on. It really gave you a very good insight as to how these young people, now she's a young woman, and she was very capable of, when she had a good day, she could sit down and she could sit and type everything out and continue the story. And on other days, she might just walk around and have a spoon in her hand, and this was
Right,
her
self-stimulating
so it went from
behavior.
one extreme to the other, but for people that really have very little experience with it, it is a beginning to expose them more to the open society at large, you know, what it's all about.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
people are
and
not
that's
afraid about it.
that's an interesting point, because the more awareness you have of it, the more accepting society will be of it, and that's great. But you know, we should hold really no illusions that, you know, society is really going to be terribly accepting of behaviors that are so bizarre and can be so bizarre You know, that you really have to gauge yourself in terms of, before we're going out, what exactly do I have to do to make this successful? Because, you know, I'm sure the kid's not terribly comfortable either, exhibiting
I
those
disagree.
behaviors in a very uncomfortable
Yeah,
social setting.
because I work now in daycare, and I see children that have different situations, different issues, and I find that the children of today are much more open and much more receptive than they were maybe 15, 20 years ago when I taught. And I remember having one or two students that did have certain situations that were not labeled in those days. I think one of the other things too is perhaps we tend to label children too quickly, and when we do label them, unfortunately, it remains with them their whole life, and it's very difficult for them to really undo.
Yeah, and parents especially take that approach, you know, we don't want to be labeled right away.
Yeah.
But, you know, there comes a time when all of a sudden, now I have to be labeled because I have to get into this classroom, I have to do this, and make sure you're labeled the right way. And so it really is, it's a catch-22. First, no, how dare you label my child, to, okay, you know, what are we going to label him so we can get the most that he's entitled to? Yes.
There was also a program on TV, I forget the program, about autism a few weeks ago, and that was stressing that some children are normal, walking, talking, developing until like 2 or 3, and then all of a sudden they change. And did she cover that in her book?
She did not. Well, she did briefly in terms of describing the spectrum, and where it starts and where it comes from. And she did cite those. No, it's not. That's not very common. When it happens, though, it's got to be devastating. It's got to be devastating.
Does she go into why the range is so wide?
It's the lowest end of the. She doesn't really go into this the why, but she certainly characterizes it.
Or why is it so large?
Because it's. She doesn't really speak to why it's so large. She speaks of it being large, and the reason why it is large because it describes different levels of functioning. Some guys are self-sufficient on the highest end, PhDs, etc. But they fall into the Asperger's autism spectrum because of their social, if you will, retardation. They're socially not. Somebody help me. They're socially not.
Socially inept.
Thank you. And so that's the far end. But in every other way, they're very capable academically, and so on.
And also Asperger's wasn't recognized till the 90s as a diagnosis. So, and then it came to light, so there's been a lot of people living with Asperger's their whole life, we're just not aware of it.
What about the food? Does she say anything about nutrition or?
She doesn't speak to that, but there's a lot of talk about allergies. People with food allergies and how that affects people. And she doesn't get into that at all in terms of the nutritional part of it.
My son was finally diagnosed a couple of years ago with Asperger's. We, even though we had supposedly great psychologists and whatever in the area, he's now going to be 16. When he was in 3rd grade, I said, could it be that he has depression? No. Because I didn't know what it was, but there was something there. From there, things continued, and there was nothing totally blaring, though there were a lot of times where we felt very uncomfortable because things were just not where they were supposed to be. And finally, in 7th grade, he couldn't do it anymore. But you know what? That's when the mother stepped in me and said to my husband, "This is it. I really don't care about the medical stuff here. The psychologist, because he can't be that great. This kid's spiraling out of control. We're going to get a psychiatrist. We're going to, and we're going to be there. And I'm in charge. My husband happens to be a doctor. I said, I'm in charge. That's it. And I'm happy to report that my kid is 16. 2 years ago, he was finally labeled because I kept pushing. You know, we had him tested. And he has Asperger's. And that's okay. But he's very, very high functioning. He is a shaker. And he, you know, has got like a 90-some average. He's on varsity tennis. And while he, you know, functions well in school, it's still hard for him socially, you know. But he's functioning, and you are so right, because in 7th grade, I chose not to leave him alone for 1 moment. And my expectations would be something very simple. Now we kind of say, oh my God, look at what our expectations were to what my expectations are. But I did push, and I did have them, because you know what? He needed to have, we all need to have some expectations.
And I think they get that. I think these kids do.
And because I kept at it, he is, he's doing well. My thing is, I would love to help him develop social skills.
In time, I mean, that's happening. I mean, you have to take it one shot at a time.
Right.
The first thing you have to do, and obviously very well you've done, is you know, getting through school, etc. And it's very interesting how. Yes.
Make a suggestion. Just a good book to read for Asperger's and autism is Temple Grandin. I don't know if anybody's heard of her, but she's an autistic woman who has her engineering degree. She's brilliant, but she talks about thinking in pictures, you know, and she talks about her childhood with autism. You would have thought she was a severe, you know, autistic child, but she talks about when she hit adolescence, the most important thing to her was that she did get diagnosed, and she was depressed and anxious, which comes about with puberty, and she was prescribed medication, and she's a real firm believer in, you know, antidepressants and different things.
Exactly, and he is on that, and you know, some people are very anti that, and that's fine, but you know, we've seen the difference before and after, and it'll be a lifelong situation, and that's okay, because if you're diabetic, there are times that, you know, exercise and lowering this and that just doesn't cut it, and that's okay. But I just want to answer you one thing about allergies. My husband happens to be an allergist, and years ago, before we knew that my son was on the spectrum, somebody had said to him, could you please, it was a personal friend, see our child because they have autism. They're right there in the middle of the spectrum. And fortunately, my husband said, there's no correlation. I said, you know what, I don't care. They're personal friends. Go to the library, spend a weekend, and he did. And he reviewed the literature. In his position, there is none. And if there were, I would be really happy, because then he would be able to, but he does not. In his opinion, medical opinion, and in their group, they do not think that there's a correlation. So.
Does the author mention anything about the possible relationship between autism and disorders like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia?
No, she doesn't, but they seem to go hand in hand.
There does seem to be a relationship.
You know, the bipolar, the autistic spectrum, there does seem to be a connection there, and maybe bipolar is an offshoot of.
Or perhaps some of the same brain mechanisms that create one.
Well, that's the frustrating part. Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Nobody knows. You know, there's no blood test. There's no physical exam.
Actually, I think they may know more about what causes bipolar.
But most of the diagnoses are based on observations of behavior, and that's how you determine, you know, what slot you put it in the Asperger's autism spectrum.
And I think the lack of a medical structure. I mean, the whole approach has been the early intervention program, which is an educational model. And that's much more empirical, I mean, trial and error, if you will, than medically or scientifically organized.
Cool. Any more questions? If not, really thank you for coming, Rich, and
My pleasure.
really appreciate it.
Thank you.